Apache girl, chained in a barn. Lonely cowboy freed her and froze when she said his mom's name. Welcome, friends, to another journey into the heart of the American frontier. Before we ride into today's tale of fate, courage, and unexpected connections in the Old West, take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our stories. And I'm curious, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from today. Are you watching from the comfort of your home in Brazil, perhaps enjoying this with your morning coffee in Europe, or maybe during a quiet evening in Asia? Let us know in the comments below. Now, settle in as we travel back to the untamed Arizona territory of 1878, where a chance encounter between a lonely cowboy and a captive Apache girl will reveal a connection neither could have imagined. The summer of 1878 burned across the Arizona territory like God's own branding iron. Drought had turned the land brittle, and tensions between settlers and the Apache were stretched just as thin. Thomas Blackwood wiped sweat from his brow as he guided his chestnut mare along the dusty trail toward Copper Springs. At 36, time had weathered his face like the red rocks surrounding him. His clothes were trail-worn but serviceable, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and the wide-brimmed hat that shielded his eyes from the merciless sun. 3 years as a solitary rancher hadn't eased the hollow feeling in his chest. The small homestead he'd built 10 miles outside of town provided shelter, but never quite felt like home. Most nights, his only companions were memories and a bottle of whiskey. "Just supplies and back, Sadie," he murmured to his horse. And no lingering in town this time. As they rounded the bend that would bring Copper Springs into view, Thomas noticed a plume of dust rising from a property he knew belonged to Silas Wade, a cattle baron with a reputation as harsh as the desert itself. Something made Thomas pull Sadie to a halt. The distant shouts and commotions sparked his curiosity, or perhaps it was instinct. He hesitated, then turned his horse toward the Wade ranch. He told himself it was just to ensure nothing was amiss. The closer he got, the clearer the scene became. 3 of Wade's ranch hands were dragging someone, toward a weathered barn. A young woman, her dark hair tangled and wild, fought against them with every step. "Caught this Apache devil girl sneaking around the property," one of the men called out when he spotted Thomas approaching. "Your boss says to keep her locked up until the cavalry passes through next week." Thomas dismounted slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Seems like a lot of trouble for one girl." The largest of Wade's men, a bull-necked fellow with a week's worth of stubble, spat on the ground. "Found her with Wade's pocket watch, thieving Apache. Lucky the boss didn't just shoot her and be done with it." The young woman, who couldn't have been more than 18, glared defiantly despite the bruise darkening her cheekbone. Her hands were bound with rough rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw. "Wade around?" Thomas asked casually. "Rode to Tucson on business. Won't be back for 3 days." Thomas nodded, watching as they secured the girl to a post inside the barn. "The cavalry, you say?" "Yeah, passing through next week. They'll deal with her proper." The men finished their task, then headed back to the main house, leaving Thomas standing alone in the yard. He knew what dealing with her proper likely meant. The cavalry wasn't known for leniency with native prisoners, especially women. He should leave. This wasn't his business. Wade was not a man to cross, and getting involved with Apache affairs was asking for trouble. Yet as Thomas mounted Sadie and began to ride away, the image of the girl's fierce eyes stayed with him. Something in that defiant gaze reminded him of someone he'd known long ago. By nightfall, Thomas had completed his errands in town, but found himself unable to shake the thought of the imprisoned girl. After dark, he made his decision. Turning Sadie back toward Wade's ranch, he rode quietly, with only the stars as witnesses. The Wade ranch lay quiet under the vast canopy of stars. Only a single lantern burned in the bunkhouse window, where the hands would be playing cards or already sleeping off the day's work. Thomas approached on foot, having left Sadie tethered a safe distance away. The barn door creaked as he eased it open, and he winced at the sound. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and horses. In the far corner, the Apache girl sat slumped against the post, her wrists bloody from struggling against her bonds. At the sound of his entrance, she lifted her head, eyes instantly alert and wary. "I'm not here to hurt you," Thomas whispered, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I'm going to cut you loose." She watched him silently, suspicion evident in every line of her body. Thomas knelt beside her, careful to maintain some distance. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 16 or 17. Her face, though smudged with dirt, showed delicate features beneath the bruising. "My name's Thomas," he said, as he worked his knife carefully between her wrists to avoid cutting her. "Thomas Blackwood." At the mention of his name, something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, but it vanished so quickly he thought he might have imagined it. The ropes fell away, and she immediately pulled her hands to her chest, rubbing her raw wrists. "Can you understand me?" he asked. "Do you speak English?" For a long moment, she remained silent. Then, in a voice rough from thirst, but clear in its pronunciation, "Yes, I speak English." Thomas offered her his canteen. "What's your name?" She drank deeply before answering. "Nina." "That's not an Apache name." A hint of defiance returned to her eyes. "It is the name I choose to tell you." Thomas nodded, respecting her caution. "Fair enough. Can you walk? We need to move quickly." Nina stood in one fluid motion that belied her previous appearance of weakness. Thomas wondered if she had been playing possum, conserving energy for an escape attempt of her own. "We should," Thomas began, but froze at the sound of boots crunching on gravel outside. "Check the barn again," came a voice. "I thought I heard something." Thomas pulled Nina into the shadows behind a stack of hay bales just as the barn door swung open. A ranch hand stumbled in, lantern held high. "Anyone in here?" the man called, his words slightly slurred. He'd clearly been drinking. Thomas felt Nina tense beside him, ready to spring. He placed a restraining hand on her arm and shook his head in warning. Attacking would only make things worse. The ranch hand swept his lantern around, peering into the darkened corners, then cursed when he discovered the empty post with cut ropes. "Damn it to hell! Boys, the Apache's loose!" he shouted, turning to run back outside. "Change of plans," Thomas muttered, grabbing Nina's hand. "Run!" They burst from behind the hay bales and raced for the back of the barn. Thomas knew there was a small door used for mucking out stalls. As shouts erupted from the direction of the bunkhouse, he and Nina slipped through the door into the night. "This way," he urged, leading her toward where he'd left Sadie. They reached the mare just as lanterns began to bloom across the Wade property like fireflies. Thomas helped Nina mount, then swung up behind her. "Hold tight," he said, turning Sadie toward the mountains. "We're going to have to ride hard." As they galloped away from the ranch, shots rang out behind them, but distance and darkness made them poor targets. Still, Thomas knew they couldn't return to his homestead. It would be the first place Wade's men would look. They rode through the night, following game trails deeper into the rugged landscape where pursuit on horseback would be difficult. Nina sat rigidly in front of him, saying nothing, but her hands gripped Sadie's mane with the confidence of someone familiar with horses. When they finally stopped to rest in a sheltered canyon, the first light of dawn was beginning to seep into the sky. "We should be safe here for a few hours," Thomas said, dismounting stiffly. "We'll move again before midday." Nina slid down from the horse, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. She looked around the canyon, assessing it with practiced eyes. "There is water nearby," she said. "I can hear it." Thomas nodded, impressed. "You know this country well." Instead of answering, Nina looked directly at him for the first time since their escape. "Why did you help me? What do you want?" The bluntness of her question caught him off guard, but he respected her directness. "I don't want anything," he replied honestly. "I just couldn't leave you there." Nina studied his face as if searching for deception. "Men always want something." Thomas sighed, suddenly feeling every one of his 36 years. "I've seen enough injustice in my life. Didn't need to see more." She continued to watch him with those dark, assessing eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke words that made his blood run cold. Adeline would be proud of her son. Thomas felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath his feet. "What did you say?" "Adeline Blackwood," Nina said, her voice softer now. "She was kind to me, too, before she died." Thomas staggered back, bracing himself against a boulder. How do you know my mother's name? She died years ago, back in Texas. Nina's expression changed, revealing a vulnerability she had kept hidden until now. She saved my life when I was a child, and now her son has saved me again. Thomas stared at her, his mind reeling with questions as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the canyon walls around them. The morning sun climbed higher as Thomas built a small, smokeless fire in the shelter of the canyon. His hands worked automatically while his mind struggled to process Nina's revelation. "So tell me how you knew my mother," he said finally, passing her a cup of coffee from his saddlebag supplies. Nina wrapped her slender fingers around the tin cup, savoring its warmth. "It was 9 winters ago. Raiders attacked my people's camp while the men were away hunting. They killed many and took some children, including me." Thomas listened intently, noting how her accent became more pronounced as she spoke of painful memories. "They sold us to different places. I was taken to a ranch in Texas." She paused, her gaze distant. "Your mother was there. She worked in the big house." "Hartley Ranch," Thomas supplied, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "My mother was housekeeper there after my father died." Nina nodded. "She found me crying in the barn one night. I'd been beaten for dropping a water bucket. Instead of reporting me, she cleaned my wounds and brought me food. She taught me English words when no one was watching." Thomas could picture it clearly. His mother had always possessed a fierce compassion that sometimes put her at odds with the harsh realities of frontier life. "She told me about her son," Nina continued, "a boy who had gone to fight in the war between the states when he was just 16. She showed me a small drawing of you in a soldier's uniform." The mention of the tintype portrait sent a pang through Thomas's heart. He'd sent it to his mother from a photographer's tent at a Virginia camp, never imagining it would one day be shown to an Apache child. "What happened after?" he asked. Nina's expression darkened. "When I was 12, the rancher's son tried to—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood. "Your mother helped me escape. She gave me food, a knife, and told me to run west toward Apache lands." "That sounds like her," Thomas said softly. The rancher was very angry. 2 days later, they caught me." Nina's voice became flat, emotionless. "They brought me back and punished your mother for helping me. They made me watch." Thomas closed his eyes, a wave of sickness washing over him. He had received word of his mother's death in a coldly worded letter from the Hartley Ranch overseer. The explanation had been a fall down the stairs, a lie he had never fully believed. "Dean, I'm sorry," Nina said, watching his face. "She was brave." "Yes," Thomas managed to say past the knot in his throat. "She always was." They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the soft popping of the small fire and Sadie's occasional snorting as she grazed nearby. "How did you end up here, in Arizona territory?" Thomas finally asked. "After your mother died, I was sold again. I traveled with many masters, Texas, New Mexico, finally here." Nina's hand unconsciously touched a small scar at her temple. 2 moons ago, I escaped and found my way to my mother's people. And then Wade's men caught you." Nina's eyes flashed. "I did not steal from them. I was looking for my cousin who works at their ranch. The fat one with the red face. He put the watch in my dress and then accused me." Thomas nodded grimly. "It was an old trick, one he'd seen used before against both natives and Mexicans." "What will you do now?" he asked. "Return to my people," she answered without hesitation. "There is a small band camped in the high country, led by my mother's brother." Thomas considered their options. Wade and his men would be searching for them, and the cavalry would soon be in the area as well. The safest course would be to help Nina reach her people, then make his own way back to his homestead after the search died down. "I'll take you there," he decided. "But we'll need to be careful. Wade has friends throughout the territory." Nina studied him with those perceptive eyes. "Why would you risk more for me? Your debt to your mother's memory is already paid." Thomas couldn't fully articulate his reasons, even to himself. Part of it was indeed honoring his mother, but there was something more. A sense that helping Nina was the right thing to do, perhaps the most meaningful thing he had done in years. "Let's just say I've been wandering too long," he replied. "Might be time to do something that matters." As they prepared to move on, Nina placed a hand on his arm. "Your mother told me once that her son had a good heart but carried too many ghosts. She was right. Thomas felt something shift inside him, not healing exactly, but the first acknowledgement of a wound long ignored. "We all have our ghosts," he said. "Now let's go, before we become ones ourselves." They doused the fire and mounted Sadie once more, heading deeper into the mountains where Nina's people waited and where Thomas might finally begin to confront the shadows that had followed him since the war. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, even in the higher elevation of the mountain foothills. Thomas and Nina traveled carefully, using dry washes and rocky terrain to mask their trail. Though they had seen no sign of pursuit, both remained vigilant. "There's a trading post about 3 miles ahead," Thomas said as they paused to rest Sadie in the shade of a large boulder. "Run by an old mountain man named McGregor. He's no friend to the cavalry or ranchers like Wade. We might get supplies there." Nina looked uncertain. "Is it wise to be seen? McGregor keeps to himself. And we need food, if we're going to reach your people in the high country." She nodded reluctantly. "The journey to my uncle's camp will take 2 more days from here." They continued on, following a game trail that wound through juniper and scrub pine. As they approached the trading post, little more than a log cabin with a lean-to stable attached, Thomas grew increasingly uneasy. The usual sounds of activity were absent. "Stay with Sadie," he told Nina, drawing his Remington revolver. "If you hear shooting, ride east along that ridge and don't look back." Thomas approached the cabin cautiously. The door stood partially open, creaking slightly in the breeze. He called out, "McGregor, it's Thomas Blackwood." No answer came. With his back to the wall, Thomas pushed the door fully open with his boot and peered inside. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but he could make out McGregor's large form slumped over his rough-hewn counter. Thomas entered slowly, his revolver ready. "Ah, hell, Mac," he muttered when he reached the counter. The old trader had been shot at close range, his weathered face frozen in permanent surprise. The killing looked recent. Within hours, a quick survey of the cabin revealed ransacked shelves and open containers. Someone had searched the place thoroughly after killing McGregor. Thomas hurried back outside to find Nina already mounted on Sadie, her expression tense. "We need to go," she said before he could speak. "I saw dust to the south." Thomas swung up behind her, and they set off at a gallop, heading northeast into increasingly rugged terrain. They rode hard for nearly an hour before finally stopping in a narrow box canyon with steep walls that offered some protection. "McGregor's dead," Thomas explained as they dismounted. "Shot, probably by Wade's men." Nina's face remained impassive, but her eyes betrayed concern. "They are still hunting us." "Yes. But why kill McGregor? Unless," Thomas frowned, thinking, "unless they're eliminating anyone who might help us, which means they're taking this very personally." "The watch," Nina said suddenly, "the one they claimed I stole. Perhaps it was valuable. Valuable enough to kill for, maybe." Thomas wasn't convinced. Something about the situation felt wrong. They shared the last of Thomas's jerky and hardtack, then refilled their canteen from a small seep spring at the back of the canyon. The afternoon stretched on, the heat gradually giving way to the cooler air of early evening. We should move soon," Nina said, scanning the canyon rim. "It is not safe to—" She stopped abruptly, her head tilting as she listened. Thomas heard it too. The distant sound of horses approaching. "How did they find us?" he whispered. Nina pointed to the sky. A turkey vulture circled overhead. "They are watching for carrion birds. In this heat, they follow travelers hoping for a meal." Thomas cursed under his breath. It was an old tracker's trick he should have anticipated. "Up there," Nina said, indicating a narrow cleft in the canyon wall. "We can hide Sadie and climb higher." They led the reluctant mare into the shadowy crevice, then scrambled up the rocky slope above. The climb was treacherous, with loose shale threatening to give way under their boots, but they managed to reach a small ledge overlooking the canyon entrance. Minutes later, 4 riders entered the canyon below. Thomas recognized Wade's foreman and 2 of his ranch hands. The 4th man wore the blue uniform of a cavalry sergeant. "They're working together," Thomas muttered. "That complicates things." The men below dismounted and began searching the canyon methodically. The sergeant examined the ground where Thomas and Nina had rested, then looked up, scanning the canyon walls. "They were here all right?" The sergeant called to the others. "Not more than an hour ago. Blackwood knows these mountains." Wade's foreman responded. "If he reaches the Apache camp with the girl, we'll never find them." The sergeant spat on the ground. "That can't happen. The girl has information that could cause problems for a lot of important people. The colonel wants her silenced, and your boss agreed to handle it quietly." Thomas and Nina exchanged a glance. This was about more than a stolen watch or an escaped servant. "No, what information?" the foreman asked. "Above your pay grade," the sergeant snapped. "Just know that if she talks to the Indian agent about what she saw at the reservation, there'll be a federal investigation that'll hang half the officers in the territory and a few businessmen too." One of the ranch hands pointed toward the cleft where they had hidden Sadie. "Tracks lead that way." Thomas tensed, his hand moving to his revolver. Beside him, Nina silently withdrew a knife from her boot, one he hadn't realized she possessed. Just then, Sadie whinnied from her hiding place, and the men below immediately drew their weapons. "No choice now," Thomas whispered. "When I start shooting, you run along that ledge and up to the ridge. Your people's camp is northeast from here, right?" Nina nodded, her face set in determination. "I will not leave you to die." "Not planning on dying today," Thomas replied with a grim smile. "I'll be right behind you. Now get ready." Thomas took aim at the foreman first, the most dangerous of the four, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed off the canyon walls as the foreman fell. Instantly, the other men scattered for cover, returning fire. Nina darted along the narrow ledge as bullets chipped stone around them. Thomas fired again, forcing the men to keep their heads down, then began making his own way along the ledge. A bullet grazed his left arm, burning like a hot poker. He stumbled, but kept moving, emptying his revolver at their pursuers. As he reached the point where the ledge met the slope leading to the ridge, he saw Nina waiting for him instead of continuing on. "Go!" he shouted. She shook her head stubbornly and pointed upward. "Together, there is another way." They scrambled up the steep incline as bullets continued to fly around them. At the top, instead of continuing over the ridge as their pursuers would expect, Nina led Thomas into a horizontal crevice, barely visible among the rocks. "Old Apache hiding place," she explained, as they crawled deeper into what proved to be a narrow tunnel through the ridge. They emerged on the other side as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. Below them stretched a maze of ravines and dry washes, perfect terrain for losing pursuers. "You're bleeding," Nina said, noticing the wound on Thomas's arm. "It's nothing, barely a scratch." She gave him a skeptical look, but didn't argue. "We must keep moving. They will find a way around the ridge soon." As they made their way down the slope, Thomas found himself wondering about Nina's cryptic words to the sergeant. What did he mean about information you have? What did you see at the reservation? Nina's expression darkened. "Soldiers and men like Wade. They steal the food and supplies meant for my people. Children starve while they sell government flour and beef to ranchers and miners. I saw them divide money. The sergeant, Wade, and others. I heard names." Thomas nodded grimly. It was an old story on the frontier. Corruption that turned already meager Indian rations into profit for unscrupulous officials and businessmen. "That's why they're so determined to find you," he said. "If you testified to the Indian agent or a federal marshal, they would hang," Nina finished simply, "as they deserve to." As night fell, they continued their journey by moonlight, moving steadily northeast toward the high country where Nina's people waited, and where Thomas hoped they might both find sanctuary from the men who were determined to silence them permanently. Dawn broke over the mountains with streaks of crimson and gold. Thomas and Nina had traveled through most of the night, catching only brief moments of rest when the terrain grew too treacherous to navigate in darkness. Thomas's wounded arm had stiffened, and though he tried to hide it, Nina noticed his increasingly labored movements. "We must stop," she said firmly when they reached a small plateau sheltered by ponderosa pines. "Your wound needs attention." Too exhausted to argue, Thomas sank down against a tree trunk. Nina examined his arm, her touch gentle but confident. "The bullet only grazed you, but there is infection starting," she said, removing a small pouch from within her dress. "I gathered herbs while you slept earlier. They will help." She worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with water from their canteen, then applying a poultice of crushed leaves and roots. The sharp, medicinal smell made Thomas's eyes water. "My grandmother was a healer," Nina explained, as she bound his arm with strips torn from her petticoat. "She taught me many things before the soldiers came." Thomas watched her face as she worked, noting the shadow that crossed her features at the mention of soldiers. "You've lost a lot," he said softly. Nina met his gaze steadily. "As have you. We are both orphans of this land, in our way." The simple truth of her words struck him deeply. Since returning from the war, Thomas had drifted through life like a ghost, never quite belonging anywhere, carrying wounds far deeper than the one on his arm. "Rest now," Nina said, moving to keep watch at the edge of the plateau. "We are close to my people's territory. By nightfall, we should reach them." Thomas didn't intend to sleep, but exhaustion pulled him under. His dreams were a chaotic blend of memories. His mother's face, battlefields strewn with the bodies of boys in blue and grey, and Nina's eyes flashing with defiance as she stood chained in Wade's barn. He woke with a start to find the sun high overhead. Nina was still at her post, scanning the landscape below with the patience of a born hunter. "Anything?" he asked, joining her. She shook her head. "No sign of them, but they are still searching. I feel it." Thomas knew better than to dismiss such intuition. "How much farther to your people's camp?" "Over that ridge," Nina pointed to a distant line of peaks, "and down into the valley beyond. Half a day's journey if we move quickly." They set off again, their pace steady despite Thomas's injury and their shared fatigue. The landscape grew increasingly wild and beautiful as they climbed higher. Towering pines, meadows dotted with wildflowers, and clear streams tumbling over moss-covered rocks. By late afternoon, they had crested the ridge Nina had indicated. Below them lay a verdant valley cradled between mountain walls. Thomas could make out thin wisps of smoke rising from what must be cooking fires, carefully kept small to avoid detection. "Udzi there," Nina said, a rare smile softening her features. "My mother's people." The relief in her voice was palpable, and Thomas felt an answering lightness in his own chest. Against considerable odds, they had made it. As they began their descent into the valley, a movement caught Thomas's eye. Sunlight glinting off metal in the trees to their right. "Down!" he shouted, pulling Nina to the ground as a shot rang out. The bullet splintered bark from a tree where she had been standing moments before. Two riders emerged from the tree line 50 yards away, the cavalry sergeant and one of Wade's men, both with rifles raised. "Run for the valley!" Thomas urged Nina, drawing his reloaded revolver. "I'll hold them off." "No!" Nina's eyes flashed with the same determination he'd first seen in the barn. "We fight together or not at all." Before he could argue, more shots rang out, but not from the direction of their pursuers. 3 Apache warriors materialized from the rocks above the trail, their rifles trained on the sergeant and the ranch hand. In the ensuing confusion, Thomas pulled Nina behind a large boulder for cover. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, the sergeant lay dead, and Wade's man was fleeing back the way they had come. The Apache warriors approached cautiously, rifles still ready. Nina stood and called to them in their shared language. A rapid exchange followed, with gestures toward Thomas and back in the direction of their pursuers. Finally, the oldest of the warriors nodded and spoke to Thomas in heavily accented English. "You are the one who freed my niece. You may come to our camp." Thomas understood the significance of this invitation. Few white men were ever welcomed into Apache camps, especially during these times of conflict. As they followed the warriors down into the valley, Nina walked beside Thomas. "My uncle says you have earned a place at our fire," she translated. "This is a great honor." The Apache camp was well hidden among the trees and rocks of the valley floor. Women paused in their work to watch as the strange procession approached, while children darted forward for a glimpse of the white man before being called back by their mothers. Nina's uncle, a dignified man named Nahilzai, led them to his family's wickiup. Inside, an elderly woman embraced Nina with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My grandmother," Nina explained to Thomas. "She thought I was dead." That evening, around a small fire, Thomas listened as Nina told her people about her captivity, escape, and their journey together. She spoke at length about the corruption she had witnessed, the stolen supplies that had left her people hungry while officials profited. When she mentioned Adeline Blackwood, several of the older Apache exchanged glances. "What is it?" Thomas asked, noticing their reaction. Nahilzai spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "Many years ago, when we still lived in the eastern mountains, there was a white woman doctor who came to our camps. She healed many of our children during a sickness. Her name was Blackwood." Thomas felt a jolt of surprise. "That was my grandmother. My mother spoke of her work with the Apache, but I thought they were just stories." Nahilzai nodded. "Not stories. Truth. The Blackwood women had strong medicine." He looked at Thomas thoughtfully. "Perhaps the grandson also." Later, as stars filled the night sky above the valley, Nina found Thomas sitting alone at the edge of the camp. "What will you do now?" she asked. Settling beside him, Thomas had been pondering that very question. "I can't go back to my homestead. Wade and his remaining men will be watching it." "You could go north," Nina suggested. "Or to California." "I could," he agreed. "Been drifting most of my life anyway." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of the valley. "Or you could stay," Nina said finally, her voice soft but steady. "My people need allies who understand the white man's ways, someone who could speak for us to the honest Indian agents, help us navigate the changes coming to our lands." Thomas looked at her, surprised by the invitation. "I'm not sure I'd be much use. I'm just a solitary rancher with a talent for finding trouble." Nina smiled, the expression transforming her solemn face. "You are the son of Adeline Blackwood. You freed a girl from chains because it was right, not because there was profit in it. Such men are rare on this frontier." Thomas gazed out at the valley, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of possibility. "My grandmother came to heal," he said slowly. "My mother taught a frightened girl when others would have ignored her suffering. Perhaps there's a pattern there worth continuing." Nina nodded, understanding in her eyes. The path finds the walker when they are ready. In that moment, under the vast Arizona sky, Thomas Blackwood felt the burdens of his past lighten slightly. The ghosts would never fully leave him. The battlefields, the years of wandering, the mother he couldn't save, but perhaps they could find peace alongside him in this unexpected sanctuary. "I'll stay," he decided, "at least until we can bring evidence of the corruption to someone who'll listen. After that," he left the thought unfinished, the future an open trail before them. "After that," Nina said with quiet certainty, "you will know where you belong." As the fire at the center of the camp burned low, casting its warm glow across the sleeping forms of Nina's people, Thomas realized that for the first time since the war, he felt something like hope. Not just for himself, but for the possibility that in this harsh and beautiful land, justice and healing might still find a way to flourish. The Apache girl chained in a barn and the lonely cowboy who freed her had both found something neither expected, a chance to honor the past by building something better for the future, guided by the memory of a woman whose compassion had created an unlikely bridge between two worlds. Soft music fades in as the camera pans out to show the mountain valley under moonlight. Remember to hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this journey into the American frontier. We'll be back next week with another tale that will capture your imagination. Until then, share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where in the world you're listening from. This is Frontier Chronicles, bringing history to life, one story at a time.